Okay, so I think we will get started. It'll be recording from the internet. Oh, hold on. I don't know what happened there. Okay, we're back. Internet issues. So this is our second survival skills workshop, and it's going to be led by me and Brian. Just to start things off, we like to start every workshop with the land acknowledgement. So McMaster University recognizes and acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and the lands that are protected within the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. This is just a very brief agenda. We want, for those who were tuned into our last workshop, this one we want to be more of a discussion, so a lot of back and forth and active questions as we go. So for those who weren't here during the coordinator presentations or during the last introduction, my name is Noah. I'm doing my master's here at McMaster on bee ecology, and I'm also part of the outdoor club and nature at McMaster.
And I'm Brian. I'm studying technology at McMaster. I do stuff with the outdoor club, and I also work around Ath and Rec and places and stuff.
Brian is a wealth of knowledge and has just come back from part of the 400-kilometer Algonquin trip, if anyone has questions about that. So to start things off, I guess we'll go right into it with knots and lashings. Like I said before, we want this to be a discussion, so we want lots of active questions or comments that people have about things that have worked well for them or haven't worked well for them, stories and things as we go. This is just a very brief list of the multitude of knots and lashings that exist out there. Many of these are good to know when you go camping. They serve many different purposes. We'll go through a couple of them, and then we'll ask people if they have questions regarding knots or if they have any suggestions of knots they like in particular or areas that they've had trouble with. So if you do have any questions or comments as we go, you can either just turn your mic off, and just say it out loud, or you can message it in the chat and we'll bring it up as we go. So it's more of a discussion. So these are the knots we had listed before. Many of them are common and some are more uncommon. So we have your traditional figure of 8, that's like a stopper knot, used a lot in climbing as well if you're a climber. And it's basically a pretty simple standard knot that most people know. You've got your double figure of 8s, which is very similar to tie, but has a multitude of uses. People can use it as like rescue seats for harnesses, can be used for tying off. You can put it around things like trees. Can use for pulling. Sometimes it's used in sailing and search and rescue. It can be used in climbing as well as anchor points. So it's got a lot of different uses. And then we have clove hitches, which is a type of tie off. It works through compression and tension, and it's also fairly standard, and it does have some drawbacks sometimes. It can slip, or if it's pulled at the wrong angle, it can come undone. So it's only used in sort of certain situations, but I happen to like it. Then you've got your square or reef knot. It's very basic. You can use it for joining ropes together, although it's not great at that, or just generally tying off things. It's not a super strong knot, but it's a common one that's used out there. It's also used often in decorative knot tying. And then you have sheet bends, which are one of the most common ways for joining two ropes together. It's really good for joining ropes of different sizes. So if you have one small thin rope and one big thick rope, it's good at that. And then you also have the double fisherman's, which is also great at joining two ropes, but normally the ropes are of equal sizes, but they don't need to be. You have your barrel hitch, which is for hanging barrels or hanging anything that's sort of round. Works best if they have a lip so that rope can sort of rest on that lip there. Otherwise it does slide off. There are ways to modify it to hold the barrel horizontally instead of vertical. So people, if they've got those big blue food barrels for canoeing, will use this sometimes, or some of the smaller bear barrels. And then you have your half hitch, which is one of the most common tie-offs that people use. It's also used in climbing. Very, very common. So those are our brief knots. There's hundreds of knots out there, and we've got a resource at the end, which is a cool website that shows videos about their uses and how to tie them. So I suggest you check that out if you have questions. Before we go on to some of the lashings, does anyone have any comments or questions regarding knots in particular? Or does Brian, do you have any additional comments on that?
Yeah, I have a comment on the half hitch tie off or whatever. If you do two half hitches, that knot is like the knot I probably tie the most. Because if you do two half hitches, you can slide it up and down the rope to tighten your thing. So say you're hanging up a tarp, if you like pull it, you can like tighten it, and then just to loosen it, you just go poop, but it'll hold because of the friction. So I really like that one.
I can echo Brian's like two half hitches. I don't know if this is just my camp's term, but like the trucker's hitch is like the other name for that. It's super great at like what Brian said, like clotheslines or hanging tarps. The other one I use a lot, which might be on the next slide, is like the bowline knot. Unless that's a figure eight stopper knot, which is
No,
actually
bowline is another one. We don't have the bowline on here, but it is another very common knot. Yeah.
super good anchoring knot for
Yeah.
anchoring a tarp, like if you're anchoring a tarp on the spine or just tying anything up, and it's pretty easy to undo, which is super lovely. Yeah, I'm not very good at knots. Is there any like ways that you guys recommend to practice for people who are maybe interested in practicing knots?
Honestly, just practice. Like, have two short cords of rope and just tie knots on your free time. It's sort of muscle memory that you have to work on. It's come to you from looking at an image necessarily, for most people at least.
Yeah, there is a resource we have at the bottom of the slides, which is a website that has animation on like how to tie the knots. So it'll do like one step at a time, and that's like a great resource if you're trying to learn how to tie knots. Because like no, like what Noah said, it's really just muscle memory and practice. So tying the knot a whole bunch of times, but having that website with the animation step by step is really useful to help figure out how to tie them.
And the website also splits, like it's got hundreds of knots on it, but it splits them into categories. So it's got camping and sailing and climbing and different areas if you're curious about checking out other classifications of knots and how to use them.
Nice, that's awesome.
Does anyone have any questions regarding any of these before we move on to lashings? It can be big or small or just a story of knots they've used. Okay, we will move on to lashings. So lashings are basically just another fancy kind of knot, really, but it's for attaching poles or wood or something together to sort of build structures normally. The three that I find are the most common are diagonal, square, and tripod. They all sort of serve different purposes, but they're all used in structure building. So if you're building tarp structures or camp furniture or things like that, you'll often use lashings because they're much stronger than if you were just sort of wrapping rope all willy-nilly. So your diagonal lashing is probably one of the more versatile ones because you can kind of use it for any desired angle. So you can look up on that link later a video of how to do it, but it's called diagonal because you can see in the image it's got diagonal ropes across the two crosses. It's very, very easy to tie, and it can be used at any angle, like we said, versus you go onto the square lashing, which is also very easy, but it's really only for 90-degree right angle attachments. But I find the square can sometimes be stronger than the diagonal lashing, but both are quite strong. It's a matter of getting the ropes tight. The tighter the ropes, the stronger your lashings are going to hold up, the stronger that structure is going to be. And then you have your tripod lashing, which looks really fancy from that image, but it's actually very simple. You're kind of just looping under and over 3 pieces of wood and then wrapping around it. And it's for exactly what it sounds like. It's for creating a tripod structure. So you could use that for like putting a tripod over a fire if you wanted to like boil water in a pot over a fire, or people use it if they want to make like camp tables and stuff as legs. So they'll do 2 sets of tripod lashings, 2 on either end, or 4 if it's a bigger structure, and things like that. Brian, do you have anything to add to lashings?
Lashing is pretty cool. You can make some really neat structures with them in the forest.
It's a very neat skill to have. And if you get really into sort of like emergency structure building, then that's what you're going to be using. You're going to be using lashings for the most part. So you can build some really cool structures. You can build chairs and tables and actual cabin things, that places to throw tarps over. You'll sometimes see people have lashed things together at campsites if you go interior backcountry camping. It's always cool to find those. Does anyone have any questions or comments or stories regarding lashings? For the most part, they're fairly straightforward, but some people run into some tricky situations with them. Got a quiet group. We want these skills to be a discussion. So a discussion of how you would use them in the backcountry or front country or just at your cottage or anywhere. And sort of build your skill base. So then we will move on, and if you have any questions at the end, we can come back to this. We'll move on to shelter building, which is pretty closely tied to knot tying and lashings. Brian, do you want to take this way?
Yeah, sure. I got it. So when you're talking about shelters, you have like 2 main categories of shelters. You have like ones that are like pre-made, those being like tents or bivvies, which are like bivvies are just really small tents for one person that are sit really low to the ground. Or you have like a tarp, so you can see in the picture how there's like a tarp structure. It's kind of got open walls, and then hammocks are often used with tarps to make another type of shelter. But then you also have survival shelters. So with the lashing we just talked about, you can make the 2 of these shelters at least, a lean-to, which is just a shelter that basically like leans on one side and it's just like one wall. And then the other one's an A-frame, which kind of is what it sounds like. It's like an A on the ground, kind of like what an old-fashioned tent looks like, except made out of like sticks and leaves and stuff. And then there's also tents or shelters you can make in the winter. So like a quincy where you like pile on snow and then hollow it out. And then you got like a nice little hole inside.
For people who don't know what a quincy is, like picture an igloo, which is made out of ice blocks, but instead of ice, it's snow. So you pile a huge pile of snow, like Brian said, and then you sort of tunnel it out. And then snow has got great insulating properties, even though you think it's cold. But once you are in there, it warms up quite a bit. And that's actually very toasty once you're in there. So for your tents and bivvies and tarps and hammocks, your manufacturer shelters, there is a multitude of them out there, different types of tents, different types of camping hammocks. Hammock camping seems to be growing in popularity these days. And you'll have like a hammock and then a tarp over top. And then you've got tents, which is sort of your traditional one. There's A-frame tents, there's dome tents, there's all sorts of kind. You've got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10-person tents. I would say the most common one is probably your 4-person. And then you've got kind of 2 or 3 classifications. You've got like your 3-season tent, or sometimes if you've got an ultralight, it can just be like a summer tent. And then you've got your winter tent, which is also sometimes called a 4-season tent. And so your sort of 2-season spring, summer ultralight tent is going to be super lightweight, but it's going to be super, super thin. So if you've got a little bit of a breeze, it's going to be chilly. So having the proper sleep equipment for those is important. So your 3-season, your sort of spring, summer, fall, probably your like workhorse, your most common tent that you're going to be using out there. It's a little bit warmer. It holds up in good weather. And then you've got your winter tent, which has different classifications. You can just have your normal winter tent that's made out of like your typical tent material that you would think of. And then you've got the heavier duty ones that are like big canvas winter tents, the ones that you sometimes see have those built-in stoves and things in them. And those are sometimes called hot tents. And they're, for the more experienced people, they require a lot of setup and staking out and poles, and they're quite heavy, but they are quite warm and meant for like really serious winter camping. And with tents, we won't get too much into it this time, and we can have the discussion later if people have questions, but there's different waterproofnesses for the floor and the ceiling, and wind and weather considerations, and lightweight versus heavier tents. So a lot of different brands of different construction materials, which can make them lighter or heavier or more waterproof, less waterproof, more ergonomic, less ergonomic. We could spend all day on just tent design. So we can briefly have a sort of question and answer period on those kind of shelters that people would like. And then your tarps, there's got your like special like $100 tarps that are these fancy silicone ones, and you've got your sort of beater, so your like blue, green, gray, typical plasticky type of tarps that many people use. They're heavier, but you're not worried if they get wrecked, that kind of stuff. I would encourage anyone who goes camping to bring at least 2 tarps with them. One for sort of your living space where you can put your gear under and cook under and things like that. And then one to either go underneath your tent to sort of protect the tent from the ground and sharp rocks and sticks and help increase that waterproofing, or to go over top of your tent for if there was like severe rainstorms, because tents are only waterproof to a degree, and then once you're past the point of saturation, you're going to start getting wet. So it's always good to have a backup, is what I'm trying to stress. So we have a question about, is a tent footprint or tarp better? So they serve slightly different purposes, but they're also very similar. So a tent footprint is normally pretty thin. It's not really waterproof at all. There are ones that are, but for the most part, they're not. They're basically just a thin piece of fabric that's meant to protect the bottom of the tent from abrasion and to sort of increase the lifespan of your tent floor. So companies do it where it's just a very thin, like probably the thinnest fabric of your tent. So it'd be like the internal part of your tent, not your tent fly. So it's not meant to be waterproof. And then that's sort of stop rubbing on with like pine needles or pine sap or like hard rocks and stuff. So you don't scratch the waterproof bottom of your actual tent versus a tarp. If you're putting it under your tent, the main purpose is waterproofing. So it's a little bit thicker. It does the same thing with stopping abrasion, but it duals as also extra waterproofing, which a footprint doesn't normally. If the tent itself, it's something you have to look at on like tent specs, is already got a fairly waterproof floor, like a high waterproof rating, then just a tent footprint is enough, because then you're just worried about stopping abrasion. But if you have a tent with a lower waterproofing for the floor, you might want to bring a tarp along to increase that waterproofing. Does anyone have any particular questions about tarps or survival structures or different types of tents or anything that we've set up until this point? Camping in different seasons, like winter camping and shelters used for those and things like that.
Do the type of tents you use differ in terms of like where you're going? Like if you were camping in a backyard, is there a specific like tent you would advise versus camping in an like unknown woods or like untrailed woods?
That's a good question. So for the most part, when you're thinking of like what they call front country camping, which is like backyard camping or camping in a campground, the biggest like consideration difference between that front country versus like an interior backcountry camping on trails would be weight. So typically when people are camping in a campground or in their backyard, they don't care how heavy the tent is. So they can kind of pick whatever they want. So those tents that are a little bit heavier are often a lot more waterproof, a lot more durable. But with that increased waterproofness and durability comes an increase in weight. So those kind of tents, you're not always worried so much about abrasion or extra tarping and things like that. And they're normally a lot cheaper to purchase. So with a decrease in weight is where the price of tents sort of shoot through the roof. So for your campground tenting, your Canadian Tire type tent or your cheaper mech tents and things like that are perfectly good and honestly probably better because you're not worried so much about them and they're going to be way more waterproof. And if you're worried about warmth, because some people get cold while they're camping, they're normally warmer as well because it's a thicker material, more insulating. Versus when you go backcountry, everyone's trying to cut down on weight, whether you're canoe camping or backcountry camping, backpacking, because at some point you're going to have to carry that equipment. And so the extra weight on your back is heavy. So people want to reduce it as much as they can, where the idea of like ultralight camping comes from. So they cut down the weight of the tent, the poles become lighter, the actual tent material becomes lighter. But when that happens, to get lighter material, they have to compromise with something. So with thinner material, it's not as waterproof. And it's not as durable, so it's more prone to abrasion and ripping, and potentially if you were in a big thunderstorm with heavy downpour, it might soak through at some point, which is why bringing those extra tarps in those times is normally better. There's also a huge cost difference. So for most people, they start off with your sort of backyard style tent. I started with those. Even doing backcountry camping, you can take them. They're just a bit heavier. And then sort of, if you get really into the activity, you'll invest in a backcountry lightweight tent for if you're doing a lot of backpacking and stuff like that. If that sort of answers that question. Anyone have any other questions? Can be big or small, can talk about seasons or anything like that. Tent placement on a campsite is also important because you don't want to be on a big hill because then you kind of roll into each other. So flat ground is good, but you also want to sort of be aware of the surroundings around it as well. You don't want to camp in a bowl where when it rains, all the water is going to roll down a hill and then pool right under your tent. Things like that. There's ways of placing a tarp under a tent properly to avoid water pooling under your tent. There's ways to roll the edges, that way the water flows under the tent instead of pooling under the tent. So we had one question about, are 3-person tents ever really enough for 3 people? So this is sort of a debated topic, but for people who don't know, there's size ratings for tents. So they're saying, oh, this tent is 1-person, 2-person, 3-person, 4-person, whatever it is. But many people say like a 3-person tent really only fits 2 people. A 4-person tent really only fits 3 people, because those tents are meant to maximize or really minimize space. So when they say a 3-person tent, they mean 3 people packed in like sardines. And normally it's 2 people in one orientation, and then the person in between them is flipped opposite. So you have like head to toe, and then the other person's head is at your feet, and then it flips back. So it's like triangles, if that makes sense. Kind of hard to picture. But oftentimes, if you're wanting to put your gear in your tent, because the tent vestibules don't have a lot of space, then a 3-person tent is like 2 people and their gear. A 4-person tent is 3 people and their gear. If you're going to fit the full 3 people or full 4 people, you are going to be very squishy. You can do it. That's why they have those ratings, but it's not as comfortable.
I also know with tents too, if they have like the double vestibules on either side, so a tent that extends out on both sides, like that just gives you so much more room for, you know, your gear to not be in your tent. You can actually maybe fit those 3 people in the tent without gear. But yeah, it's definitely a tight fit.
So which type of like tenting is your favorite kind?
I normally do like just a medium to lighter weight 3-season tent that's a 3-person, because it's got lots of space, and if I was just camping by myself or with one other person, that's what I would go with. And then I'd bring a tarp along for sort of emergencies. But I would recommend most people start out with your sort of heavier but more durable tent that is a little bit cheaper to really sort of get you into the camping routine, and you'll kind of learn what you like and don't like, versus investing in the super expensive, super lightweight tent that may or may not fit your needs. So we have one person ask about how you deal with bugs. They're hopefully not a big issue for your tents, but key is leave your door closed for whenever you are out there and be very quick going in and out of your tent. There's a million different sort of bug repellents out there, sprays and scents and candles, and there's other sort of chemical pads, things you can heat up. Just about everything out there. Only some of them really work and some of them don't, and really none of them work great. It's kind of just one of the parts of camping you have to learn to live with. Carry lots of afterbite with you and kind of make the best out of it is my suggestion. There's lots of good suggestions in the comments about bug nets with hammocks and camping in different seasons. There's sort of peak bug seasons, like black fly season is in June, and then it kind of peters out. You've got peak deer fly and mosquito seasons as well. So if you're really anti-bug, I would say the fall is your go-to camping time, September, October. It's a little bit colder, but you don't have to deal with the bugs. Does anyone have any other questions related to shelters before we move on?
I don't know if this was already asked, but what brands of tents do you find, like, I guess, like the most success out of in terms of longevity and like durability, I guess?
Oh, that is a very personal and very debated topic. There's so many different brands out there, and it's very much a personal preference. For the club, the outdoor club, we use mech tents often because they come with mech's warranty, and they're sort of a good intermediate level tent for both weight, price, and waterproofness. We've spent a lot of research, and our main tent for the club is called the Mech Camper 4. It's a 4-person tent. It's fairly waterproof. It's like medium weight, and it's pretty durable. So that's why we use it. So it kind of depends on what activities you'll be doing.
On your like personal trips, what tents have you like found like successful with or that you've enjoyed, I guess?
The MSR has a lot of good lines like the Hubba series or the Elixirs, but they do get quite pricey. Marmot makes some good tents as well. The North Face has some lines.
All right, thank you.
But it's a very personal thing, and there's a million companies out there. I'd say if you're looking at getting a tent, it's a lot of research involved, a lot of camping forums. I would suggest picking a tent from a company that has a good warranty if the store you're buying it from doesn't. Like Mech has a store-wide warranty for many of their products, and like MSR has good warranties on their products. Not every company does, so it's something to consider if you ever have any issues. Okay, I think we'll move on. So next up we have fire building. Brian, do you want to take this part away?
Yeah, I can start us off with fire building. So first, if you guys have ever built a fire before, log cabin or teepee, I want you guys to submit it in the chat. So let us know log cabin or teepee. It's a very heavily debated topic. Anyways, fire building. When you're building a fire, fire needs 3 main things to survive. It needs heat, it needs oxygen, and it needs fuel. If you've ever seen a fire that has it just you'll add a log on and it just starts to have grayish, whitish smoke, and you're like, oh, where'd all my fire go? That's because there's not enough oxygen. So that's a fun fact. That gray smoke's actually because there's not enough oxygen in your fire. But you need those three things for when you're building a fire. So there's different ways of, I see bird's nest. Oh, I see hybrid is the best. No, that's not bird's nest. There's many different ways of building a campfire. So log cabin and teepee are typically your most traditional ways of building a fire, but you can also do like a rat's nest where you like start the fire, then add some stuff on, and then you just throw a whole bunch of stuff on. And they have their benefits and their downsides. Log cabins are really good if you're trying to build a cooking fire, because the log cabin makes it flat and it burns really hot on the inside, but it burns up, so the heat all goes up. And a teepee is really good if you want to make a fire for coals, because while it's burning, you can't, like, it's harder to put something on, but the heat is contained in the inside of the teepee. That's why you like line it with sticks. It keeps the heat in. And then once all the sticks burn down, then you'll have a really nice bed of coals. So it makes a really nice coal bed burning fire. But some things to remember for fires is you need a way to light it. So having a lighter or waterproof matches or matches in a waterproof container is always a good idea. And you can also light it with a flint and steel or a bow and string or whatever, however you want to light your fire. I like to have two ways of lighting a fire, just in case. I've had trips where I've ended up upside down in the water and all my lighters get wet. So I always like to have two in different places to make sure that I always have at least one lighter that is A-okay and good to go. And so for starting fires in the rain, because on the next slide, I think we have a lot of list of stuff that makes it easy to start fires. But for starting fires in the rain, there's several good tips we can give you here. Is you want to look for stuff that lights easily. So birch bark, even when it's soaking wet, will still light really well, and it's really good to use to burn. But you can also use like a pre-made fire kit starter or like a tea light, like the ones you get at IKEA that are like the little small tea light things. Those can also help start fires when it's wet, because the wood would be wet. You can also, I've never tried that one, light a fire in a pot and then transfer it once it's lit. That's a cool idea. I've never done that personally. Another thing for starting a fire when it's wet, there's this stuff called standing deadwood, which is like stuff that's branches that have fallen off the tree but didn't hit the ground, so they're still like hanging in the tree. That stuff is really good to start fires when it's wet, because most of the time it's not actually wet, because the canopy of the tree stops all the rain from hitting those parts. So there'll be a lot more on the dry side for starting fires when it's wet and raining.
Yeah, the pot method is also great for winter camping if it's hard to get things started.
Makes sense.
Just make sure you've got a pot that you're not destroying when you do that. It's also great if it's really windy. So that's a good method if you can't get a fire started because the wind keeps hitting it. If you light it in the pot, then it kind of protects it from the wind until it's big enough to survive on its own.
So yeah, here we have a list of great fire starting materials. So as we said earlier, birch bark, but you don't want to peel the bark off the trees because that kills the trees. And you'll see like trees in Algonquin with like entire sections of bark stripped off, and then the tree like a couple of years later will just die because the bark is what protects it from bugs and insects. And if it doesn't have that, then it can't be protected. Pine sap burns really well. There's this cool thing you can do. You can actually take pine sap and stick it on a stick and then put it in the water, and it'll like shoot off just because of the reaction that the pine sap does. But pine sap burns really well. So pine sap, and then the needles and pine cones and stuff also burn very well. And then stuff like dry moss, dry grass, dryer lint from your dryers. I always take some dryer lint with me when I go camping, because if you're using a flint and steel, lighting straight to like birch bark or something is really hard. But if you have something like dryer lint, it lights like instantly, super quick. You could also use like petroleum jelly or Vaseline. They light pretty easily. Same with the battery and steel wool. If you like slap the battery on, it has to be one of the batteries where the two sides are on the same thing so that it shorts the circuit and makes the heat. But that's a really cool way of starting. And then hand sanitizer and alcohol wipes, because alcohol is flammable, and then tampons and pads because they're dry.
yeah, just some things around the house. Dryer lint I also take. It's an excellent sort of highly flammable substance. It's why they tell you to always clean out the dryer lint in your dryer, because it can catch fire if it builds up. Same reason why you want to take it on a trip. So if you keep it in a dry place, it's going to be your best bet. It'll instantly light and it can burn for a few seconds to get other things. For those who don't know, petroleum jelly is like Vaseline. Same thing, just sort of Vaseline is a brand name. So you can kind of like soak cotton balls in that and take them as fire starters as well. And like Brian was saying with the battery thing, you need like a 9-volt battery, the ones that have it on both ends. And tampons and pads are basically just big cotton balls. So that's why if you're in a pinch, those are great to use as well. So we had a question about, do we prefer flint and steel or matches? I would say matches are more preferred because they're easier to use and sort of, yeah, I guess just really easier. But matches can get wet, and then if they're not waterproof, they're no use. Or you can like keep striking and keep breaking your match heads off if you have really cheap matches. Versus flint and steels will work wet or dry, because you're basically just striking a flint stick with a piece of metal and creating sparks. So it'll always work, but it takes a bit of practice. It's a little bit harder to use. And it can be harder to get something to actually light from a spark. So I prefer matches, but both methods should work. I would just, if you're going to do flint and steel, practice it at home first before taking it on a trip as one of your main fire starting methods. Does anyone have any questions regarding fire building or any cool stories they want to share? Driftwood is also great. Someone saying in the comments, once it's dried out, or if you find it on the beach, it's normally very weathered and light because it's been floating. So it's normally very flammable as well, and it's great to use. When starting fires, you just want to remember to only take dead branches, because that's the only thing that's going to burn well. And take wood from the ground, not from standing trees. You can do hanging wood like Brian's mentioned, where it's broken off the tree but sort of stuck in the branches. That's okay, but you shouldn't be breaking branches off of trees. And if you do have wet logs, once you get your fire started, you can sort of place it around your fire and it'll dry out as the night goes on. So then you can have a constant supply of dry wood. Any other questions? Keeping fires going all night is great. You just want to make sure you always have someone watching it so things don't get out of control. Someone asked, what do you do if a fire gets out of control? So that's where keeping a fire only as big as you can physically handle is important. So especially when you're in the backcountry, you should be doing a fire as sort of necessity for warmth and cooking, or just nice to look at, but you don't need to have a giant 6-foot tall bonfire, because that's where you're going to run into potential issues. So keeping it contained, building it in proper fire pits, near water if you can, so you're easily able to douse it if you need to. And someone said if you drop a burning stove on the ground, that can be scary, and your first instinct might be to throw water on it, which you should absolutely not do, because those are gas-based fires, or oil-based, or sometimes alcohol-based if it's an alcohol stove. And so by throwing water on them, you'll often spread the blaze instead of putting it out. So you want to throw dirt on those or cover it with a pot to cut off its oxygen supply.
This is like a question more like towards burns, I guess. But if you have like an issue with an oil burn, or like if you have like, I guess like you're cooking over a fire and like you have like oil that spills on you or so, like what's the best way to handle that in the backcountry?
So I would say cooling the site as quickly as you can, because it'll continue, especially with the oil burns, it can be pretty deep. And so even if you've cooled the top layer of skin underneath, it can still be quite hot. So I would just like dunk whatever part got an oil burn in water and leave it in there for a few minutes until it's like good and cooled off. And then you can clean the area and apply like burn dressings to it. That's what I would say.
I have a story to go along with that. It's not oil, but it was marshmallow. When people say don't wave around your marshmallows when they're on fire, there's a reason. So we were at a campfire and the kid started waving around his marshmallow and it landed on another kid's hand. And like when a marshmallow is gooey, it's kind of just like an oil, right? So like sticks on it. So the first thing you want to do is like get the thing that's burning the person off of them. So like with oil or with a marshmallow, whatever, like if you're going in the backcountry, you'll probably be close to water. So just going in the water and like getting them to put their hand in the water or like where the burn is in the water and then leaving it in the water because the water will actually help cool it down, like Noah was saying. Before you want to dress it, you want to cool it down before then.
Because if you dress it before you cool it down, the burn will continue to burn within the deep tissue for quite a while because your skin is good at keeping that heat in. If you're not near water, then like pouring water bottles or like take water bottles and pour it into like a big pot if you have one with you and then like stick your hand in the pot or something like that. Whatever you can to, or if you have a tarp, you can pour water on a tarp and then kind of like stick your hand in the pool on the tarp. However you can quickly cool the site, because cooling is the most important part of any burn. Are there any other questions? Okay, then we will move on. So next is water purification. So why water purification and how? So no matter what any story people tells you of, oh, I've never done it or this or that, you should always plan to purify your water when you're camping. Some campgrounds have what they call potable water, which has already been purified from the tap, but many campgrounds do not. You'll have to see at the campground you're at. But when you're backcountry camping, you'll never have potable water. It'll always be just water from a lake or river. And then you always want to purify that. There can be all kinds of dirt and viruses and bacteria or protozoa in the water. One thing you can get in Northern Ontario is beaver fever, which sounds funny, but certainly is not. If you ask anyone who's had it or you look up stories, it's miserable. But there are many other sort of waterborne diseases you can get from it, which some of them can be quite serious, and you can end up like not paralyzed, but very close to it, where you've like lost all your energy, crazy diarrhea and throwing up, and some people end up needing to get evacuated if they contract some of these things. So it's important to be very careful. So a tip when gathering water is gathering as far away from the shore as possible, because the shore is where the water level is lower, water sort of sits, it's not as moving, and there's more particulate matter floating in it. So if you're canoe camping, I would canoe out to the middle of the lake and collect your water from there, or if you're beside getting it from a creek or river, trying to collect water from the middle of the creek or river. Creeks and rivers, you're not necessarily as worried because it's flowing, so it's normally a little bit cleaner. So from the edge might not be an issue. Try not to collect water near marshes and swamps, because that water can often be dirtier and more particulate matter in it. So that's your number one. And there's a number of different methods for water purification. We've listed some of the top ones, like boiling, where you need to boil it for, like, get it to a full rolling boil, not just hot. You actually need to see like bubbles forming. And that should go for at least 1 to 3 minutes. Some people say longer, but the health authorities say it's not really necessary. It's just the 1 to 3 minute mark, because it's just hot enough to sort of kill or break down any of those bacteria or viruses in the water. You can do tabs or drops, or there's gravity and pump filters and life straws and lots of different brands of things out there. What many of these don't filter out is chemical contaminants. So for the most part, it's not an issue, but some of the like far north lakes in Canada, and depending on where you are, have mercury in them, or arsenic and lead, or even when the outdoor club goes to the Grand Canyon, there happens to be a couple of rivers where they tell you not to take water from because there's actually uranium in them. So you kind of have to know and do the research of where you're going to go, because most of these filters will not filter out those kind of chemical contaminants. The filters are mainly for biological contaminants. Some of them that have like activated charcoal filters can filter out some chemicals, but not all. These are just some photos of some of the ones for those who don't really know what I'm talking about. So we have on the left just boiling water, which is sort of your easiest to do, but most people will recommend 2 methods of purification to have on a trip. Often people have boiling as one, and then they bring one of these other options as their other one. So you've got Aquatabs, or there's other brands, are really common. They're basically a chlorine or iodine tablet where you drop in the water, you shake until it's dissolved, and then you leave for about 30 minutes. And then that purifies the water that way. Or you have drops like the Pristine brand, where you take a powder or a liquid or 2 liquids, and you mix them together and then pour them in your water and mix them around and then wait the 30 minutes, very similar to the tabs, but I find harder to use and just messier in general, so I don't really like them. But they're often cheaper because you can get that whole big bottle for the same cost as your tabs, but it'll last you way longer. And then you have your gravity and pump filters. So gravity filters works the same way it sounds. You hang a bag in a tree or something, and then it slowly filters through gravity into some sort of water catchment system that you have, like your water bottle or a container or a pot. And then the pump filters work very similar. They've got the same kind of filter, but you are manually pumping the water through instead of letting gravity do it. And many of those filters have like activated charcoal filters within them. So some of them are okay for chemical contaminants, but many of them aren't, versus your tabs and drops will not work for chemicals. So they're only biological, as well as boiling is only biological. And then you have life straws, which are basically filters, but you're just like drinking directly from a body of water through them. They can be kind of exhausting to use, and some of you can see them now. They have like water bottles that have built in with them, so they're pretty easy to use, but they're not good for filtering large amounts of water. Some of these filters, you have to be careful where you go, because depending on what the biological agent is, they can actually be small enough to be able to swim right through the filters and not be filtered out. Like I know when the outdoor club went to Hawaii, there's, I forget what it was, but a species of protozoa in the water there, that there was actually signs warning you, your filters will not filter this out. You must use a chemical drop like chlorine or iodine. So it's just important to do the research of where you're going to go to know what could be in your water and what kind of purification method you need. Anyone have any questions regarding water purification or purification system questions? Yeah, the life straw comment, they're very, that's why I said time consuming. You got to like really suck really hard on those. They a little bit hard to use because you're pulling the water up through that carbon filter. So it takes a lot of effort. And that's why they're not good for purifying large amounts. With your filters, they can also get clogged up or get holes in them, or the seals break. So you should always have a backup. You should never rely on a filter alone when you go camping. I would often suggest, if you're taking a filter, you take either a tablet or a drop out with you as well, in case your filter breaks or gets clogged. Because once they're clogged, they're pretty much garbage. They're very hard to clean out. And they can be quite expensive, versus the tabs and drops are fairly cheap. Any questions or stories or comments? Big or small? Can be a lot of information to take in. My favorite is just taking aqua tabs because they're easy, lightweight, fit in your pocket. If you're going on big trips with like a camp or something, you can actually get the larger aqua tabs. Like these are 1 tab for 1 liter and they come in packs of 50, but you can get like giant ones that work for like 10 liters of water for 1 tab, and these massive tablets. Because I don't like how expensive filters can be, and they can be messy to use because they get dirty and clog up and break down. And I don't know, honestly, I don't know why anyone uses drops. I really don't like them, but that's a personal preference. Okay, then we will move on to, I think, our final category. Emergency kits, or survival kits, as some people call them. Brian, do you want to take this one away?
Yeah, sure. I'm gonna go a little bit faster on this one, just because we've been here for about an hour and 10ish minutes. But with emergency kits, that's all the kind of stuff that you want in case of an emergency. Wow, surprising, right? So obviously you want some first aid supplies, basic first aid kit, gauze, tape, all your usual candidates there. You want some lighters or matches or fire starters. So those are like backup ones that you don't use regularly that you keep in your emergency kit. You also, sometimes it's good to have some general gear repairs. We talked a little bit earlier about ground sheets and not having ground sheets. If you poke a hole in your tent or you break a pole, it's really useful to have some little quick materials, just a quick fix, so that you can like finish your trip instead of having to evac out because of a gear mishap. A compass and map are good to have all the time, and again, your water purification, like we just talked about. A knife or a multi-tool is very useful for a multitude of things, especially if it's a pocket knife that has like different foldy outy things that you can use and stuff. Whistles are great for scaring away bears, getting people's attention, or scaring away bears, because bears don't like loud noises. Tea light candles are also great, as we talked about in the fire section, for starting fires. So the Mylar blanket, or a bivvy, Noah, that's like the emergency blanket, question mark?
Yeah, those little, like, they look like aluminum foil blankets, the bright
All right.
silver ones. They are great for trapping heat in and warming people up.
Yeah, so those are great for warming people up. Emergency, you can also make emergency shelters out of them. And a bivvy is like a really small tent, so it could be considered an emergency shelter. Aluminum foil is always great to have because it's aluminum and it's foily. It's great for cooking though, if you're catching a fish or making baked potatoes on the campfire. Aluminum foil is just like a really handy thing to have
You
on
can
hand.
also makeshift it into pots and things if you need, if you have something break or forget.
1 second. It started raining really hard and making lots of noise. Small rope or cord, it's always useful to have. So if you want to hang a tarp or like hang a food barrel, having rope or like an amount of cord would be very useful. Headlamp or flashlight. Surprise, it gets dark when the sun goes down. So those are very useful to have. And then a brightly colored poncho in case it rains or you need to get somebody's attention.
Yeah, whistles and ponchos are important, or like a bright colored tarp or something. It's always good to have. Just, you never know if things happen. They're great for search and rescue personnel to find you. Most recommend everyone takes a whistle when they go out, even if you're just going out for a hike. That's why a lot of backpacks you'll see have whistles built into their breast straps. That's for that exact reason, because that's how you can communicate with search and rescues, or get people's attention. And then a bright colored poncho or tarp if you ever needed to be seen from a helicopter or plane or something. And this is not an exhaustive list. There's many things that could be added to this, and depending on what situation you were in, or winter camping versus fall versus summer, or different things. And you don't necessarily need to have all of these in like a kit together. They could be spread out amongst your backpack, or they can be in a kit all together if you want. But it's good to always have a checklist when you're packing, so you make sure you have all of these somewhere and you know where they are. Does anyone have any questions regarding emergency kits or anything related to those? This was our last topic, so if you have questions regarding this or anything else from the rest of the talk.
Also, it sounded like a few of you were interested in specific gear things. Feel free after this, sometime today, tomorrow, next week, during the school year, whenever, feel free to send Noah or I a message. We know a lot about gear, and sometimes it can be boring to list off all the things we know, but if you have a question about like, what tent should I buy, just feel free to send us a message, and we can definitely get back to you there too.
And the Outdoor Club is planning on hosting some very similar outdoor skills workshops like these throughout the term, where we'll be going over specific pieces of gear and having more gear-centric workshops if anyone's interested in going in more detail. Any questions, comments, stories? Don't be shy. Yes, I believe the Outdoor Club meeting is on the 24th with the Outdoor Club, Climbing Club, and nature at Mac. Actually, I think it might be the 25th on the Tuesday, but I would have to double check the 24th. It is the 24th. I just checked. Yeah, it is the 24th. And that'll be a meeting with just to get some information about the outdoor club, the climbing club, and the other activities within outdoor recreation to sort of, if you're interested in staying involved come the fall semester. Does anyone have any wild repair stories or issues they've had with gear while out in the back country or front country, or something's failed on them? Ever gone camping and realize you're missing a tent pole and have to fashion one out of a stick or something like that? Or have a tent pole snap while out in high winds? Oh, forgetting tent poles on a 14-day trip, that's rough. It's where you gotta be good at fashioning stick poles. Does anyone else have any cool stories? Or funny stories, or things that the group can learn from? Oh. Yeah, canoe is not something you want to break on you. That's why bringing a canoe repair kit is sometimes good if you're on canoe trips. I would say tent poles are probably the #1 issue that people have, or rips in tents and tarps and things like that. So those patch kits come in handy.
Yeah, wrapping canoes, that's a fun time. If nobody has anything else they would like to say, then I think we'll click to our next slide. And these are just a list of resources that we've quickly put together that you guys can use if you want. And yeah, Noah, do you have any final remarks?
No, that's pretty much it. It's not an exhaustive list. I would suggest do your own research. That's really the only way to truly learn. That first link, the animated knots, is really good because it shows you all the different knots out there for the most part, and easy to follow steps and videos. And it tells you what each use for each knot is if you're curious about which knots you would use in certain situations, like which knots to tie off or anchoring or joining ropes together, or which knots are for climbing or sailing or camping or anything like that, or fishing. So it lays it all out really easily for you. And then the other ones are just some general advice links regarding camping and kits and water purification and things like that. But if you have any questions during the rest of Virtual Moose or at any point throughout the year, you can feel free to message Brian or myself or the Outdoor Club, and we will help you to the best of our abilities. Are there any final questions, comments, remarks? If not, I will stop the recording. And we'll be posting this slides afterwards for anyone who wants to take a look at them.